Welcome back to the 6Ps podcast for our final look at the 7 stages of grieving. We're going to be reading through scenes 18 to 24. Just a bit of an overview, as we have done for the past couple of videos. We're going to start with some pre-reading information and a brief summary of the scenes we're looking at today before going through a reading of these scenes. And we're going to finish off with a brief analysis of each of these. One final look at the pre-reading information. Of course, we only have one person on the stage, which is the everywoman or the woman, as is referenced in this text. The sets are very minimal, but we are looking at stage directions particularly to look out for props and sound effects, which add more detail. Particularly, it's quite pertinent because some of these scenes don't actually have any dialogue. Now, it is a non-linear structure, and we've already seen a couple of flashbacks in this particular text to the past. Please note with those stage directions, they are in italics. They are crucial in understanding the performance and definitely something that you should be quoting in your comparative essays. Now, before we start our reading, just a bit of housekeeping with the previous video. There was a typo when it came to scene 14, which is mugshot. The name should have been Daniel Yock, Y-O-C-K, not Yocky with an E on the end. So Daniel Yock, and I've included a link to an article about his story in the previous video's show notes. So please have a read through that. It's really important and pertinent information, particularly when we're talking about things like the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Let's look at a bit of an overview of each of the scenes we're going to read through today. Scene 18 is story of a brother. So we've had story of a father. Now we're going to go to story of a brother, where the woman describes her brother's life and highlights the cyclical nature of crime, addiction, poverty, and I guess also shame as well, which is very relevant to that scene. The next two scenes have no dialogue. 19, The Gallery of Sorrow, is a visual representation of the 7 stages of Aboriginal history. And scene 20, Suitcase Opening, the woman opens her suitcase and fills it with earth and photographs and grieves. There is again no dialogue for that. Scene 21 is a poem, Reconciliation, the poem which breaks down the word reconciliation and critiques it as just that, a word. Scene 22 is called Everything Has Its Time. This quote was referenced in a previous scene, in fact, and it is where the woman packs the word reconciliation into her suitcase. And there's a more hopeful atmosphere that builds for the audience. And Everything Has Its Time was quoted in scene 5. Scene 23, which was the initial closing scene, is the woman summarising her grief before prompting the audience to consider the past and their future actions. And the final scene, scene 24, walking across bridges, the woman recounts the reconciliation march across Sydney Harbour Bridge, which happened in the year 2000. In terms of key themes, racism and discrimination, particularly in scene 18, are apparent. We've got grief, which continues, and then the next couple, truth, justice, power, and equality, particularly build the last couple of scenes, which are all about reconciliation and that, I guess, fight for acknowledgement and acceptance and the need for reconciliation. Scene 18, Story of a Brother. The sound of laughter. The woman comes forward to tell her story. I have a brother. He's 21 years old. This one night, he was walking down the mall with 2 of his mates. Pissed as. They were walking along and, you know, in the mall, all those little cameras you see with the big black bug eyes, they are watching them. True. They wanted one of my brother's friends. I don't know why, in connection to something or to question him because some other black kid had done something wrong. You know how we all look alike. And so they came down to get him. My brother said, you can't take him away, you've got no right. They basically said they did have the right, and they grabbed my brother's friend. Now, this fella, my brother, he's not the smartest of men, and when he's on the charge, the woman demonstrates. He can be a little clumsy. He thought, this fella's done nothing wrong. So, with his sense of justice and him sticking up for his bungees, he pushed the police officer, and the police officer pushed back, so he pushed again. I said leave him alone. Another police officer fairly lifted him onto the ground, his arm up his back, him kicking and swearing, handcuffs back of the car. They charged him. No good, that fella. Shame. They charged him with, as a magistrate, assault or obstructing the course of justice, or something. He was fined $1,000 and put on a 2-month probation. It wasn't that serious. But when Dad went to pick him up from the watch house in the middle of the night, the shame was palpable. Because of the shame, my brother just budgalled around the house, chucked in his job, couldn't get the dole, couldn't pay his fine, had to front court. When the dole did come in, he was too slack with his diary, lost it. Borrowed money from Mum and Dad, which made him even more dependent and embarrassed. To cope, he went out all night with his mates, got pissed, broke his probation, got another fine. 3rd strike. This is how it starts. The cycle. This cycle. I know it happens. I know it can happen to anyone. But in our family, to be shamed out like that eats your spirit, your life. We've seen it before. We've seen it too many times. Cousins going in, and then you get that call. My brother fronts court in 2 weeks, and the family's still wondering what's going to happen. Scene 19, Gallery of Sorrow. A collection of images appears depicting the phases of Aboriginal history. Dreaming, invasion, genocide, protection, assimilation, self-determination, and reconciliation. Scene 20, Suitcase Opening. The woman paints herself as if preparing for war. Though her movements are restricted, her voice assails the audience with a sense of all-encompassing sorrow. She takes a suitcase, opens it, throwing the red earth and family photos it contains all over the floor. The woman grieves over the photographs. The woman leaves. Images of landscape interweave with family portraits, creating a tapestry of land and people. Music fills the space. There is a feeling of catharsis and release. Scene 21, Rec Con Silly Nation Poem. The woman returns to the performing area cleansed, fresh. Written in childlike script, the words Rec, Con, Silly, Nation are projected. The boats are ready for departure, if you don't want to say. A wreck on arrival, a changing flag. A con, a silly pride for sale. My nation knows my identity. A sun, a land, a people travelling. What a mess. Scene 22. Everything has its time. The woman addresses the audience. The space is full of words. Rec, con, silly, nation. Some people write it like this. Rec, con, silly, nation. What's use in having a word if we don't think and talk about it? In the end, it isn't something you read or write that changes your life. It's something you do. The woman retrieves a suitcase. The word reconciliation is packed into it. The woman jocks the suitcase. Everything has its time. Everything has its time. Scene 23. Plea. The woman carries a suitcase with her as she approaches the audience. You know, there's this grieving. Grieving for our land, our families, our cultures. But we've been taught to cry quietly, where only our eyes betray us with tears. But now, we can no longer wait. I'm scared my heart is hardening. I am so full and know my capacity for grief. I fear I can no longer grieve. What can I do? These are my stories. These are my people's stories. They need to be told. The woman places the suitcase down at the feet of the audience. Scene 24. Walking across bridges. When we get to North Sydney Station, it hits me. The train stops and the doors open, and everyone is moving. You get onto the platform and you realise it's packed, slowly moving up the stairs and through the turnstiles, and more trains coming. And I'm on the phone to my friends saying they got to get down here. Something's going off. It takes us 40 minutes to get to the street. I mean, they've stopped taking the tickets. They've turned off the gate machines and just letting people through. And as we walk down that hill and you see the bridge, and suddenly you can see how many people there are walking across the bridge. And I get that tingle. I get that tingle now just talking about it. Pause. I mean, there's so many people. Pause. I'm walking across the bridge, and if you look from a distance, it's like a colourful snake. Pause. Like a rainbow serpent. Pause. In the middle of the bridge, I stop and there's an old auntie. She's staring up through the bridge and she's crying, not the kind of crying you do at funerals. This is different. I look up and I can see the flag flying on the bridge. The red, black and yellow. Pause. They've written sorry. Pause. They've written sorry across the sky. Pause. They said over 250,000 people walked that day, and then more in Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, all around the country. Like a song that caught on. Walking across bridges. Who would have thought, eh? I guess we can't go back now. So let's go through some of these scenes together. We'll start with scene 18, which is, I guess, a bit of a callback to Story of a Father. But this time it's about her brother, who is unable to escape crime, poverty and addiction. And this is a cycle which repeats itself, something that, again, is difficult to escape. I think it also links to scene 14, Mugshot, and the death of Daniel Vock. And in the late 80s, early 90s, just before this was written, there was a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, which stemmed from systemic failure and neglect. So again, that real world illusion that you can reference. Think about the structure of this as well. It occurs right after the kinship systems are explored in scene 17. So something to think about there. The repetition of the word shame too is so powerful, and the impact this has on individuals. And it also depicts the harsh and brutal reality when she says, we've seen it happen before. We've seen it too many times. And she's not just referring to her brother then. She's talking about so many First Nations people, this cycle that can't be broken. There's no support from the government to change these failures, which again is why it touches on Mugshot. Something as well to think about is that quote, "You can't take him away, you've got no right." They basically said that they did have the right and they grabbed my brother's friend. You know, that also for me, that quote links back to the invasion poem quite profoundly. Scene 19. Before I go on, I didn't quite explain the kinship systems. So you've got the kinship systems explored. So I guess the Indigenous, customs and laws about kinship systems. And then you've got the Australian sort of legal system and the institutions like police and the law and how they sort of govern it. And I guess the juxtaposition between these two and the consequences for the Indigenous people. C19, Gallery of Sorrow. Obviously the stage directions are really important there because there's no dialogue. We are going to touch on this a little bit later on, but this is particularly pertinent because it sort of pushes the audience to reflect on these words, given what they've seen in the previous scenes. They are hopefully considering each of these sort of phases and thinking about the previous scenes which link to that. And again, providing them with greater knowledge and greater understanding and awareness about these particular terms and how they play out still today, that these traverse time. These aren't specific moments in time, these are still happening. Scene 20 likewise lacks dialogue, and again, as I mentioned there, it provides the audience with time to reflect on their feelings and emotions while also considering the actions that they're going to take. Something to think about is the importance of land. The woman throws the red earth out along with family photos, so it's not just about memory of individuals, it's about connection to land that's been lost. And in fact, there's images of landscape which interweave with family portraits, which create that tapestry. So again, the importance of land is focused upon here. Something else to take note of as well is the grief, which I guess the suitcase symbolizes. The character is no longer able to bottle up her grief. It explodes, just like the suitcase sort of opens and everything falls onto the ground. And the grief is quite profound and goes beyond the individual. So that's really important as well. It is for a loss that cannot be given words, hence there's no dialogue. But there are reminders everywhere in the people, in the photographs, and the land as well, were represented through the red earth. So quite again, a really important scene, and one that you might want to analyse in a bit more detail. We come now to scene 21, Reconciliation Poem. It is, of course, a play on words, it's a pun, with negative emphasis on the words or the syllables that make up the word reconciliation. And here there's a real criticism of its true meaning and purpose. This notion that reconciliation is just that, it's just 4 syllables placed together. There's no meaning for it, that it's really all talk and no action. The next scene, everything has its time. You've got the stage direction, that the space is full of words, which I think is really important to have a look at as well. That again, it is about actions, it's not just about words. And the repetition of that phrase, everything has its time. It's a bit more hopeful here, that phrase which we saw in scene 5. You've also got the suitcase again. It's filled with those memories from the past, the grief and the trauma. But now there is some optimism as the word reconciliation goes into it, that there is a chance. And again, it's in the next scene particularly where the audience is provided with the responsibility and accountability. Let's move on to scene 23 while we're here. Play. Again, the character talks about grief. She says, "I'm so full and know my capacity for grief. I fear I can no longer grieve. What can I do?" Again, she's speaking on behalf of all First Nations people. What can I do? Is there a bit of a rhetorical question? It's there to pose the audience. And at the end, the stage directions, the woman places the suitcase down at the feet of the audience. The audience can't ignore that they need to understand the grief now based on the previous scenes. They realise that reconciliation is just a word. They need to contemplate and consider their actions and the responsibility that they're going to take at the very end. Something small I noticed is the word suitcase was capitalised at the very end. You was going to say maybe look to analyse that in terms of emphasises its significance, but I did note in previous scenes as well it has been capitalised occasionally, so maybe just ignore that note that I've made myself there. Let's move to the last scene, which is walking across bridges. It's a reference to the 2000 marches which happened across Australia, but particularly one that happened across Sydney Harbour Bridge. Obviously, the phrasing, walking across bridges are symbolic as well, I should say. A bridge is used to mend or to align two people or two groups or two pieces of land together. So here we're talking about two groups of people and them coming together. I've said their symbolism is simile. It's like a colourful snake. It's like a rainbow serpent. And that is a reference, of course, to the rainbow serpent, which represents one of the great and powerful forces of nature and spirit. It is connected to water, and the rainbow serpent is the great life giver and protector of water. So really, really important. It's a life giver, that the rainbow serpent here, through the march that's happening, gives life and hope and optimism to the First Nations people. Look at the stage directions. There's a lot of pausing that's going on, again allowing the audience to reflect and consider actions. And the ending. Who would have thought, eh? I guess we can't go back now. There's, hope for emancipation from the past, that the past is now in the past and they can look towards the future. With this particular scene, it was actually added in the year 2002 as part of a rewrite. Something to consider is, if we were to sort of rewrite this play, would we add an extra scene in there potentially? We did have the apology to the stolen generations by then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008, which was, again, a symbolic recognition of issues resulting from force protection and assimilation. I will sort of guide you to the very start of the play, the foreword, because Mailman and Enoch in their foreword reference an 8th phase, which is treaty and sovereignty, and the negotiation for recognition of dreaming and survival. And this is quite pertinent at the moment of this time of recording, because there are discussions about writing a treaty in the state of Victoria. Before I leave today, I wanted to sort of encourage you to, as I said previously, go out and pick scenes and analyse them in a lot more detail. And I thought I'd pick a scene 19 in this case, which has no dialogue, as one that you can definitely analyse and use in your essays. Now, this scene is pretty straightforward. It's just a sort of paragraph of stage directions, which says a collection of images appear depicting the phases of Aboriginal history: dreaming, invasion, genocide, protection, assimilation, self-determination, and reconciliation. And what I sort of think is important about this is it's all about the audience. They have to reflect on the real and authentic nature of the particular play. If you look at this scene 19, you'll notice that each of the other scenes sort of connects to a moment in these phases of Aboriginal history. So dreaming, invasion, genocide, protection, assimilation, and self-determination. And I tried to sort of, pop in each of these scenes into a different section here. Now, you'll note that the last phase is reconciliation, which doesn't appear before scene 19, but that's, I guess, part of the structure of the play, is the writers, the playwrights, really focus on these first phases and really provide those authentic experiences for the audience to give these phases context, to give them added meaning and authenticity, and almost prepares the audience for reconciliation. I mean, the audience themselves has experienced all this grief, so now they will see this is a time for reconciliation. The audience are ready, and once the nation is ready to acknowledge and accept the past, that reconciliation can occur. Something else to consider, given the grief involved in those phases, is the block of ice, which we saw at the very start of the play. These are the frozen tears. This is the grief and the trauma that's been experienced by First Nations people. And slowly but surely it melts. And once again, by the time we sort of get to this scene, it's also almost been unfrozen. So again, a symbol to reference from the very start of the play that has meaning, even though it's not really referenced. You can definitely do so in terms of these final scenes that appear. Let's consider some key takeouts from these scenes in relation to the longest memory. I think the role of shame is something that could be explored. You could compare Whitechapel with the brother and the internal and external suffering. So with Whitechapel, it's really that physical feeling of shame and guilt that he sort of feels, particularly in that first chapter. I think that's quite pertinent. And again, there are many other characters you could sort of reflect on with this. My next point was to compare the role of Lydia from The Longest Memory with the non-Indigenous audience from the play. So focusing on the importance of actions and activism in fighting against systemic racism, and also the roles that allies can play in that, and the importance of of them, that it's not simply up to those who are enslaved or First Nations people to seek hope and freedom and justice as well. Consider both the endings of the texts as well. Does the 7 Stages of Grieving offer a more hopeful and optimistic message to the audience compared to the Longest Memory? For me, I think a really simplistic analysis would be just that the 7 Stages of Grieving is much more optimistic, given the fact there's that walking across the bridges as a final scene. But again, I think there's definitely hope in the Longest Memory. I think the relationship between Lydia and Chapel is particularly hopeful and optimistic and portrayed in a really positive light. Even Mr. Whitechapel speculates that it might be possible to abolish slavery. As an audience reading this text, we know slavery was abolished through the abolitionist movement and the Civil War, so there's a bit of dramatic irony there as well. And even with great-granddaughter and that dream of returning to Africa, I definitely think there is a sense of optimism for the audience as well. Something else I haven't mentioned, but sort of came up before when I was talking about grief, was the collective experience of grief that the First Nations people feel. And that's really depicted throughout the play against the individual feelings of grief, which again come up in both texts, but particularly the Longest Memory through the characters and their descriptions and detailings of events. But even in saying that, there is intergenerational grief that's felt, that's passed on from one generation to the other. As I said, I've really only scratched the surface with this particular play through these videos, and I definitely encourage you to undertake further analysis. I know that's what we're definitely going to be doing in class. We're going to be memorizing key quotations and picking out certain scenes, particularly ones that maybe aren't analysed in a whole lot of essays that we've seen in previous exams. So again, find your own unique perspectives from these texts. Really think about those stage directions, think about the props, the symbols, the sound, and really showcase in your essays a holistic knowledge of the text. That you're not just focusing on, say, one character in one scene, you're thinking about the whole text and how it works together, the way that it's structured, and the authorial intent. Why have Enoch and Mailman written this particular play? Why have they, sequenced the scenes in that particular order? What messages are they sending? And particularly at the very, very end to the audience. Good luck with your analysis though, and I look forward to joining you once again on the 6Ps podcast very soon.